Well, it's been a bit over 2 days since the release of this new season, so it's time to go and overreact. That's right, it's time to go for some sweeping, broad statements about the remaining 6 months or something of this season will go based on barely 2 days of data. Now, we are looking for today at Mythic Plus for the very simple fact that the raid perhaps will take a bit longer to get some conclusive evidence, you know, like for example, more guilds actually getting into Mythic, you know, a few more bosses actually getting to be defeated. So it is perhaps still a bit too early to go for that, but Mythic Plus, you know, players have been able to go in there non-stop all the time since the release of this season, so we can start to see some trends based on what we expected coming into the season and see how any of these predictions have been carried out in the beginning of this new season. Let's start with what perhaps was going to have the least amount of contention, the least amount of doubts, which was our predicted healer tier list, provided that this used to be, of course, mixed both Mythic Plus and raid wise. If we were to talk about specifically about Mythic Plus, it was then Discipline Priest and Mysterious Monk were the two main expected ones to become very popular, with Discipline ahead. So when we go and look at the current popularity of the healer specs in these very first few days of Mythic Plus, then we do see Discipline being easily ahead of the rest. These are the top 2,000 keys so far, basically plus 10s being completed in these first few days, and Discipline is more than the rest of the healers combined, right? So this shows just enough, just about what we wanted to point out when it comes to healers. So these are 10 plus, 10 to 11, again 50% or so of priest, but even in the all key levels you can still see that Discipline Priest is going to be the one chosen by the player base to be, at the very least for now, the to-go healer in Mythic Plus. Now, moving on to something a bit more contentious, but still doesn't look like it will hold on that much longer, is the tanks. Now, the tanks are going out more or less as planned, with Vengeance and Protpal and Blood Decay, just like we expected. And this is where you say, hold on a second, Izen, you also put this thing right here very high up on the tier list. Yes, but that was with the big asterisk of whether or not the melee comp, the turbo cleave triple melee comp with a Mysterious Monk healer, was going to establish itself in Mythic Plus. I don't know if you have noticed, you probably would have by now, but Prot Warrior's DPS right now is insane. It would fit very well in a melee comp, but as we are about to see, it's not really something that has been established so far in Mythic Plus. We are, of course, a bit too early for that, so players are just playing anything, basically. This is practically a rainbow of random colors splashed all over the keys, and we do see Prot Paladin and Vengeance Demon Hunter being the two more popular ones. Now, it's also relevant to point out that as soon as you start going into slightly more challenging keys, Vengeance starts to pull ahead a bit more, and then you go into even higher keys and Vengeance pulls out even further up. So already, even though the gap between lower keys and higher keys is just 2 or 3 levels, you do start seeing already Vengeance Demon Hunter starting to slowly pull ahead of the rest of the tanks. Now, where things, of course, will get way more spicy is when we talk about the DPS. This was our tier list, our pre-season revisited post-balance tuning tier list we had a few days ago. Yes, again, this was mixed between Mythic Plus and the raid, but we do see some familiar faces right now being popular in Mythic Plus, whether it is straight from the top 2,000 keys right now being done, or from Raider.io's key levels, even you know, all keys being completed. First of all, we have to point something before we even go about the popularity of the specs, about one in particular, because we need to give the official confirmation for the season, right? We need to let the season begin with the statement that augmentation is dead. And you're like, well, you know, but 2.8%, it kind of has a chance maybe to, you know, to grow in there. No, that's devastation. Augmentation is not visible. Okay, that's just, hold on. There we go. 1,600 augmentation evokers out of 690,000 logged DPS. So we're talking about this like 0.15% of the DPS are augmentation right now. That is the first confirmation, the first confirmed fact of the season. After that, it's good to know that many of our popular picks that we put in our tier list are there, because Starting from the S tier, we put Elemental Enhancement and Balance, which are amongst the most played specs. We also put BM Hunter, Fire Mage, Arms Warrior, we put Havoc Demon Hunter, we also put Shadow Priest. All of them are above the 4%, actually all above 5% besides BM of the more played specs. The one outlier right now of the ones we didn't mention being very good, although we did mention now they were finally freed to have at least a chance to be considered in Mythic Plus, was Devastation. Because with the confirmation that Augmentation is indeed dead, at least Devastation has a chance to be considered in a Mythic Plus group now. The other one, which was actually, though, we have to point out, updated after the results, even after, as we mentioned, even after the nerfs, the bug fix nerf to their Divine Hammer was Red Paladin. And to nobody's surprise, continues to be an extremely popular spec, you know, even if we go back to Season 1, where Red Paladin wasn't one of the main super popular DPS at very high key levels. As you can see, there is no red in here. However, it was very, very popular still. So we are pretty much continuing going into Season 2 with Red Paladin being just as popular. Except now, as mentioned, the chances of Red Paladin becoming good, if we continue down this route of Vengeance Demon Hunter eventually becoming the 2-go tank, then definitely the chances of a Red Paladin to be quite popular remain there. Yes, of course, it's also worth pointing out that once you go from all Mythic Plus key levels to actually difficult keys right now, it evens out with the rest of the DPS. You know, right now it's Enhancement, Fire, Balance, next to Red Paladin. And then the second layer of popular spec is Devastation, Havoc, Destruction, Frost, Elemental, Shadow, Subtlety, BM, and slightly lower down Arms Warrior as well. We maybe perhaps put a few too much hope on Feral being good, because it is good actually in terms of damage, but Balanced Druid right now is just overall more popular, and perhaps the surprising results of Subtlety Rogues doing very, very high AoE damage at the moment in Mythic Plus is doing quite well for the moment. Now, of course, when you look at things like these, what gets more exciting is to start bickering about DPS numbers, which are going to be, of course, extremely wildly varied given the very low amount of entries for each and every spec, since we are so early in the season, right? So, for example, we haven't even mentioned yet once Unholy or Demo, and they are in the top 4 of damage done, for example. So looking at this damage right now is rather irrelevant, as it will change a lot, both for players going up in keys and also players actually getting an idea of what they are pulling, how much damage can they pull out in different packs, tanks, learning the routes in Mythic Plus keys, for example. So this will be, of course, changing a lot. Not to mention, of course, there is the whole deal around having or not having a 2-piece or a 4-piece set bonus from the new season, etc., etc. So for now, we can tell more from the popularity of the specs being played rather than their current damage in just a couple of days. Now, talking about damage, of course, to no surprise, Prot Warrior is the highest damage, and it's very relevant because the meta tank wasn't really going to be Blood, so rather their competition would be Vengeance Demon Hunter, the currently more popular one, which is far lower down currently the damage of Protection Warrior. What is perhaps more surprising is the damage of the healers, which is a bit low compared to the damage they were able to pull off in the PTR, of course, even you know, accounting for the item level difference. The damage is a bit lower than expected, especially not just for Holy Paladin, but for Resto Druid as well. Abysmal damage right now, and even the top 2, which were supposed to be, are still Mistweaver and Discipline, have pretty low damage, and the gap between Mistweaver and Discipline is actually quite small compared to what we were expecting. To be fair, again, just like for the DPS, they need a few more days to learn the keys to actually do better damage. It goes the same for healers. Perhaps right now, healers are more worried about actually learning the mechanics and keeping players alive rather than greeding for more damage. But just like it goes for healers, it's not really that relevant to look at the damage for the moment compared to the DPS as well, because we are so early in the season. You know, if we go by the average score of each spec, you would see the bottom terrible tiers only being some 30, like 36 score away from the S tier. 36 score is basically timing an 11 instead of a 10, and that's how you jump an entire like 2 different tiers. So it's not really that relevant right now to look at the score either. It will paint a bigger picture to just look at instead the popularity, to have an idea of what players are thinking about going for. For example, it's not that you have to care too much about Arcane being some 70 or 60 score below Frost, because it doesn't mean much. What means much more is that there are 17 Arcane mages out of 4,600 specs completing 10 plus keys. That's way more relevant than their current, score, or even down to their current DPS. That is what is more relevant to look at right now in these very first few early days in Mythic Plus, to see the trends of the popularity of the specs. As we mentioned, not to brag too much, we have been spot on pretty much all of the popular ones, with perhaps the major miss, the major outlier we didn't consider nearly as much being Subrogue. Subrogue right now is pulling a lot of DPS. It's playing as Trickster as expected. It's doing exactly what you would expect when you see the damage because of the buffed and buffed and buffed again Nimble Flurry. This, by the way, on release used to be, I think, 15% cleave damage. This is basically the Blade Flurry version for Subtlety Rogue. This used to be, back in the day when it was early introduced, 15% of your normal damage with your auto attacks, backstab, shadow strike, and eviscerate. This was 15%, and now it's 60% of your cleave damage. So now your standard consistent AoE damage has gotten much, much stronger. Yes, you still have Black Powder, yes, you still have secret techniques, but Nimble Flurry is what has given you way more consistent AoE damage in Mythic Plus, to the point where now you are quite high up in terms of AoE DPS as a Subrogue. So out of the ones we were expecting doing quite well, many of which we were perfectly expecting, with the death of Augmentation, sure, Devastation, Havoc, Balance, Fire, Destro amongst the Warlock specs, Enhancement and Elemental, Shadow Priest, BM, Red Paladin, not nearly as much Subrogue. We were fearing, though, we still are actually fearing for Windwalker and for Havoc because of the very same things we mention every time when we talk about the meta. The fact that it's about whether or not a color of your same class will also be big. If a color of your class is big, it's much harder for you to be big. This is possibly what will end up for Discipline versus Shadow. Eventually one of the two will be chosen to be meta and the other will die, like you see very often, even just this last season with Resto and the Shamans, and then Resto goes away and the Shamans go up. That's perfectly expected. It will happen between these two specs, it will happen between Prot and Ret, it will happen with Mistweaver as well as Windwalker Monk, and also between Vengeance and Havoc. So that's one of the risks you run playing these kind of specs in Mythic Plus. But this was the first few days worth of data, worth of entries when it comes to Mythic Plus, as players start climbing more and more higher level keys, and also when most players are still busy just farming, for example, 8 keys or 10 keys just for gear, rather than because they want to climb a score right now. It's much more important at the moment to grab some gear and power rather than IO score, for example, in Mythic Plus. But this was still worth enough to give us an idea of how specs are performing so far in Mythic Plus. As we pointed out, less so about their DPS score or how well they are doing in terms of numbers overall, but rather in terms of their popularity, in terms of what players are going for in these first few days of Mythic Plus, to try to draw in an initial picture of the meta for the season. So for today, on this Friday, we are done with our Mythic Plus, our first very early on Mythic Plus recap of the season. So with this out of the way, expecting to see way more developments by the end of this reset, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with of course everyone else who has been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's almost that time. We have to start undressing bit by bit. Every degree that goes up, more clothes come off.